complicated this is about when you're wounded and you're still in the Army, and then you're wounded, and then you're out of the Army. Then it's completely two different departments. It's the Pentagon versus the VA, and it's, you know this better than I do. But in any case, we got the rule changed so the caregivers didn't have to deal with this bureaucratic snafu. So that was exciting.
So in 2009, when the battle at Combat Outpost Keating took place, there was also a difficult political decision-making process going on about the strategy in Afghanistan. It's something we've talked a lot about on this podcast with General McChrystal and David Axelrod. What connections did you see between the on-the-ground events that happened in your book and the high-level political debate that was going on in Washington at the time?
Well, there were residual effects because you can't escape it. When there's a lot of stuff going on at the time, okay, when the colonel and the lieutenant colonel with 361 Cav came in that spring, that May, to RC East, and the Lieutenant Colonel Brad Brown was at FOB Bostic in Kunar Province, and his boss Randy George, who's now a general, was I think in Jalalabad. They came in with a plan to close a whole bunch of these cops. Now, about these cops, the combat outposts had been put up in 2006 under then Colonel, then General, and now retired General Mick Nicholson. He was doing the best he could with what he could in 2006, which was, well, now we have this, now we're supposed to nation build. I mean, that's not how he would put it, but now we're supposed to nation build, but we have a fraction of the troops and not nowhere near the number of helicopters that my friends in Iraq have. So the best I can do is set up these little FOBs and cops all over RC East. Those decisions that were being made under the circumstances of the Bush years, and I think Bob Gates was the Secretary of Defense at that. No, it was Rumsfeld, and then Rumsfeld was fired at the end of 2006, and then Gates took over. That had an effect on how they set it up. Now, in 2009, when McChrystal came in, he made a lot of changes too, and one of his changes was to invest diplomatically, emotionally, and more with Hamid Karzai, who was the leader of Afghanistan at the time. And so Randy George and Brad Brown came in, the colonel and lieutenant colonel, and they were like, we want to shut down these 4, I think it was, cops, including Cop Keating. And McChrystal had competing considerations going on. In fact, I have a chapter in the book called General McChrystal's Competing Considerations. And it was about all the other things that he was trying to balance when these guys came in and tried to close the COP. And it included a battle going on up north that had to do with the election. And Hamid Karzai didn't want U.S. troops pulling out and FOBs and COPs and OPs shutting down before the election. And ultimately, it was delayed, closing down the COP. And then it was too late. Then the attack came on October 3rd. But those political considerations, and also just the McChrystal and the whole celebrity general thing, played a part in his confidence and in what he did and in how he made decisions over there. And I'm not second guessing what he did. I'm just laying out all, the reason I put in the whole chapter, his competing considerations. There were a lot of service members and their families who were mad at McChrystal. Why didn't you? They found out later that George and Brown wanted to shut down the COP and he wouldn't let them. And why wouldn't he? Well, I wanted to explain his considerations. I'm not saying that they were right or wrong, but it certainly played a role.
Chicago, the Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts,
this is Chicagoland.
We had a previous guest on our show, Chris Marvin, who is the founder of Got Your Six.
Oh, great group, yeah.
And he touched on this stereotype in society that veterans and service members are these broken people with post-traumatic stress. And as a result of that stereotype, society often either just has pity on these people, gives them charity, or just has low expectations for them and their ability to function in society. How do you, in your writing and in your advocacy, approach those issues?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, you guys know this better than I do, but it's like saying all service members are conservative. I mean, that's not true. I mean, certainly not among the officer corps, right? I mean, everything's complicated. And I know service members now who are still working things out. And I don't know that I would be any different, And I know service members that seem fine. And they've moved on and they're working hard, and I'm sure they have some bad memories here and there, but generally speaking, they're moving forward. And so I know not to stereotype about any of this stuff, because I know some extremely conservative veterans, I know some extremely liberal veterans, and in the same way that they run the gamut politically, they run the gamut emotionally. You guys know this, that a rough estimate of how many people join the military because they have troubles already and they go into the military to try to get their head on straight, or because some judge somewhere said, well, you're either going to prison or you're joining the military, and they end up joining the military. I mean, that's a factor too. Sometimes some people enter the military with issues. That's something that we don't talk about often, but sometimes, the car is broken before it leaves the lot. And so I just know that every veteran's different, and just to be aware of these things. I mean, I don't ask people, did you ever kill anybody? I mean, like, I know what not to ask, but generally speaking, other than stupid questions not to ask, I just assume everybody's different and take it from there.
There's a wide range of people who have served, and it's important to, when giving a realistic portrayal, to have those realistic aspects in it.
Yeah, totally. But by this, I mean, and also it's complicated. It's a complicated issue,
right?
Because you want to be sensitive, but again, you don't want to assume that every veteran is like a wounded sparrow and needs to be treated gingerly. And it's as adults, we're able to like comprehend nuance, but sometimes in the current political battles and discussions, things get stereotyped or generalized, or they're made black and white, and obviously there's a world of nuance, especially when it comes to people who fight in war.
So shifting gears a little bit to talking about your current line of work as a journalist and as someone who reports on military affairs, there's a concern from scholars in the civil military affairs community that the military is becoming less transparent. What do you as a journalist make of that relationship between the press and the military?
The military is becoming less transparent, and it was pretty opaque before. And I have a lot of regard for General Mattis, but I will say he did not help in this regard, because there were very few, if any, briefings. I mean, of all people, Rumsfeld was, Ellison's invisible man compared to Mattis. And again, I have tremendous regard for him on any number of levels, but that is not one of them. Yeah, it's opaque, and I think that there is a natural distrust of the media by the military, and I think probably a lot of that dates back to Vietnam. And I get it, but I can just tell you from my job as a journalist, and also writing the book, The Outpost, where I was trying to, at the time, nobody had heard of Cop Keating. People now know it a little bit better. Two of the guys there have been awarded the Medal of Honor. There have been books written about it, including mine, but also Clint Romeshay, one of the Medal of Honor awardees, wrote a book called Red Platoon. My book's being made into a movie. I think his might be made into a movie as well. There have been other books. Dan Rodriguez wrote one. Anyway, my only point is nobody had heard of it, and I was just trying to bring attention to this cop and this horrible battle. And, the Pentagon was not cooperative. They were not. I had to file FOIAs. There's not, they were ignored. The only way that I could get, what are after action reports called? 10-6s or something?
We don't know.
I'm not sure.
Okay. I forget what the term is for. But there were the after action reports. I only got them from family members who were given them. But I didn't, the Pentagon did not hand them over, even though they were public enough to hand over to family members. So I don't know. I mean, I've been saying this for a long time. I mean, I think the Pentagon, there is a problem in this country of the chasm between those who serve and those who enjoy that service but do not, most of us, the 99% of us, there is a chasm between us, and I'm trying to bridge it, but the Pentagon, in my view, too often is pulling up the drawbridge, is not helping the dialogue. And now there are exceptions to this. There are people who are friendly. There are PAs who are helpful. But as a general rule, I mean, I think it's been more than a year since the Pentagon had an on-camera briefing. I think Gene Simmons spoke from the podium more recently at the Pentagon, more recently than a Pentagon spokesperson or the Secretary of Defense.
Right.
So, I don't know.
So what steps can we take to improve that relationship between the press and between the military? Is it just that the Pentagon needs to hold more press briefings, or is there anything else we can...
I mean, I think the Pentagon needs to hold more press briefings, but also I just think the bureaucracy of the Pentagon is very difficult to figure out who you're supposed to talk to if you're covering any sort of thing. But like, for instance, I mean, do you think the public has any idea that President Trump just authorized 1,000 service members sent to the Middle East as a response to Iran? I mean, I don't. We've mentioned it on air, but I mean, there isn't a lot of detail about where they're going or what they're going to do. And I mean, I think that I understand operational security. I mean, we don't want to like be putting anybody in harm's way, but there just isn't a lot of sharing of information. I mean, think about that horrible ambush in Niger a few years ago. 4 American service members died. It wasn't just the public. Members of the House and Senate on relevant committees, the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, they didn't know that we had more than 1,000 troops in Niger. I mean, it's just, there just is so little information shared that I think it also harms this relationship between the 1% and the 99%.
So there are people in the military who are okay with the fact, obviously, they're okay with the fact that the DoD is being less transparent with the public and that the Pentagon hasn't held press briefings in about a year, because sometimes people feel, you mentioned the distrust earlier, people feel like journalists and news organizations just inevitably spin things into a partisan narrative and want to give things a hyper-political context. What do you make of that argument?
Well, look, I've been covered too, and I get that not all coverage is what you want and what you like, and you know, we all want to be portrayed at our best, on our best day, doing our best thing, and the media doesn't necessarily always focus on that, and I do that for a living, but also I have been victim's the wrong word, but I have been subject to it, and I get it, but I don't think that's an excuse. First of all, service members in the military work for the public, and the way that our American system is set up is to have a free and independent press writing about what people in power are doing. And certainly, you know, it's not just U.S. senators and presidents who are people in power. People with guns who are sent, you know, thousands of miles away to do things in our national interest are also people in power. And it's our job to cover it. And as long as we're, you know, look, there's always a back and forth when it comes to people being covered and how they're being covered. And I think that's fair, and that give and take is fair. And if people are bad journalists, lying, misrepresenting, sure, I mean, then that's one thing. But I think it's very important that that kind of thriving independent press coverage of military participation, deployments, conflicts, I think that's essential. I mean, I think that if I think it's an important part of, I mean, if I get that I don't want to state that the war in Vietnam was a mistake, but I mean, I will say that it's very obvious from our coverage and what's emerged later that people certainly in the Johnson administration, but let's just say in the Johnson and Nixon administrations, knew that the war could not be won the way that they were hoping to win it, and they kept that from the public. And what ultimately turned the tide for the public to turn against these generals who were lying to the public and sacrificing all these men and some women in service of this lie, what turned the tide was media coverage of the war and facts about the war coming to light. Not that the service members serving there were bad, but whether or not the mission they were on was futile. And I think that it's it protects the soldiers as much as the generals want to protect the soldiers.